After the ban list and YCS Anaheim, the state of the game actually looks like it's gonna be in a good place. Today, we're gonna be going over what I believe to be some of the best decks going into this format. And if you're not already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because in future videos, not only are we gonna go over the best budget decks to play, but we're also gonna go over some of the best tech cards in the game, be it hand traps, board breakers, or even side deck cards. But I got my cards and I've got my coffee, so let's go over the best decks. So as a quick summary, obviously with the conclusion of YCS Anaheim, Ryziel just won the event. Congrats to Triff Gaming, well deserved, and the deck was insane. Going into the event, decks like Ryziel and Malice had the spotlight on them, and people really wanted to know how well they would perform, especially in a Snake Eyes Yubel format. But directly after the event, we had the ban list revealed to us, which definitely shakes up the game. But we'll talk about those impacts in a little bit. Obviously, for the first deck I wanted to talk about, it's going to be Ryziel. Here I have Engraver representing the Fiendsmith package, and whether you play it with the Fiendsmith cards or just play it pure, it's totally up to you. The fact that this deck did really well at the YCS plus other decks being hit, it's a no-brainer. This deck is gonna be amazing. Obviously, the deck has its flaws, and it is easy to prepare for, especially now that we know this deck is gonna be good. The side deck can be very well set to counter it. Also, the popularity of stuff like Snake Eyes is gonna be way down, so you might not even need infinite hand traps in your main deck anymore. In time, the format will develop, and we'll see what adjustments are made in everybody's tech cards. But hands down, it's a no-brainer. This deck is gonna be amazing in this format, and whether it's the clear-cut best deck, time will tell. But another amazing deck to talk about, of course, is the Malice deck. Personally, this is one of my favorite decks to play this format. It's very cool, very controlling, but it's also very combo intensive. A Cyberse link climbing pile that can also play D-Shifter. It's so amazing. You can pair the deck with Bestials or even Kashtiras. It's so versatile, and you have so much room for non-engine, just like the Ryziel deck. But also, just like the Ryziel deck, it does have some flaws. Floodgates are very good against this deck. Obviously, Ryziel can struggle with D-Barrier, but Malice struggles with Lancia. And I'm sure I'm going to talk about this more in the tech card video that's going to be coming out soon, but Lancia is definitely looking like it should be a side deck staple. Going into Anaheim, people really didn't like the idea of Lancia because it was only really there for Malice, even though it did catch stuff like Ritual Beast on the side. But after the results of Anaheim, it's very clear to see that this deck is going to be around in the meta. And speaking of decks that are going to be around in the meta, it's the pure Fiendsmith deck. In this case, I have a Fenrir for the Kashtira variant, but of course there's the Magical Musket variant as well, so kind of count those as the same deck because conceptually they are. This deck is very low to the ground. It doesn't do the craziest combos, and whether you're playing the musket cards or the Kashtiras, you have so much room for non-engine. Whether or not the format's going to call for 18 plus hand traps, time will tell, and I don't think that's going to be the case now that Ryziel is going to be even more popular. But that being said, the deck is super flexible, so you can cut back on those hand traps and just play more breakers and tech cards in your deck. My only worry with this deck is since it trades so good into hand traps, and hand traps are going to start getting cut, the deck's end board isn't that crazy, even though it has a great grind game, so we'll see if it's enough in this format. And one deck I definitely think people are not respecting is the Yubel deck. I still think this deck is insane. Sure, you lost 2 Phantoms, which is very relevant. You can still go into your 1 Phantom early to help play through hand traps, and just the existence of this deck really makes it to where you almost feel obligated to play a bunch of hand traps to make sure you stop this deck. Even with 1 Phantom, the end boards this deck makes are completely crazy, and I think you have to respect it. And don't forget, you have a lot of ways to recycle your Phantom of Yubel. The field spell can put it back in the extra, as well as the Unchained Link monsters when they get destroyed. Also, we have 3 copies of Gates again, and I don't know how much that's really going to change because that card by itself plays really badly into Detonator. But again, time will tell. I still think you have to respect this deck. The combos it makes is crazy, and you can play so much non-engine as well. But one deck I really think is going to have an uprising in this format is going to be the Labyrinth deck. The problem with this deck was last format there were so many combo decks that it was very hard for this deck to go second. Obviously, there's still combo decks running around, but now dealing with the decks we currently have, it's going to be so much easier. I also think this deck has a really great Ryziel matchup, not only because Detonator isn't the best card against this deck, but you can get access to D-Barriers so easily and recycle it every turn with Lovely. Another thing to note is this deck can get access to Artifact Sanctum, which gets you access to Lancia, so that's so good against Malice. And one of my favorite things about this deck is you can play Daruma Karma Cannon, which is a crazy blowout card in so many matchups. Not only stopping combos in its track, but also sending a bunch of Link monsters to the grave, which obviously is really great against Malice. Plus, when you pair it with the Butler, you do have potential to use these trap cards on turn 0. You know me, maybe I'm a little biased, but I definitely love playing this deck. And speaking of bias, one deck I really love playing is the Mermail Lanian deck. The deck is full power and it does have some flaws. Obviously, the Charmies are really great against this deck, as well as Droll and Lockbird. But with the current state of the game, those hand traps might not be main deck this format. Droll feels like it's only good against half the decks in the format, so it might just be better in the side. And that goes for the Charmies as well. While there are decks it's really crazy against, it's still not the best against everything. Plus, if people start pivoting to a board breaker approach, then this deck can full combo for free and start ripping their hand apart. But it's definitely a deck you don't want to sleep on, including the next one, which is actually going to be the Tenpai deck. I really don't know how well this deck's going to play into the format, because so many of the cards are now at 1. Obviously, everything you need to OTK is still there, but the problem is if you don't kill your opponent, it's insanely hard to be able to kill them on the next turn. That being said, this deck still has all the tools to be able to combat the current meta, so I definitely would still respect this deck. There's already going to be a lot of D-barrier in the format, so maybe this will keep this deck out of the format, but just know you have to respect this deck still. It can OTK out of nowhere, and that's why I thought I'd have to mention it in the top 8 decks. And then the last one, which might catch you by surprise, is actually the Snake Eye deck. No, pure Snake Eye is definitely gone. You don't have OSS, so you really don't have that many options. And the fact that you can still pair your stuff up with the Sinful Spoils cards if you decide to play Witch is definitely an option. But really, the best home for those cards, I really think is going to be in the Fire King deck. And even though you don't have OSS to get you into your Ponix, don't forget that still technically Snake Eyes Ash can search the Ponix to hand, so there's a lot of ways you can still manipulate that engine in deck. Who knows, maybe you'll actually go more into a pure Fire King list and you can actually exclude the Snake Eye cards. But of all the decks in this video, it's the one that I have the most question marks about, because the cards are so powerful and there's definitely something there, but the question becomes, is it good enough to beat any of the other tier 1.5 or tier 2 decks in the last format? Or is the Fire King cards with stuff like the Fiendsmiths just good enough to beat a lot of the decks in the format? And like I mentioned, maybe the Snake Eyes engine gets cut entirely. Time will tell, but I definitely think one way or another, at least the Fire King portion of this deck is here to stay somewhere around the format. There's obviously so many other decks in the format to choose from, and that's why I like where the format is right now. You have so many options. Obviously, there's stuff like Ritual Beast, but that kind of gets caught in the crossfire with Lancia. Heck, you can't forget about the Runic variants that were running around last format. The only thing about that deck now is you might banish one of their Malice monsters, and they can start playing on turn 0. But who knows, maybe a new deck will rise from the ashes and show us what really this format's gonna look like. Regardless, I'm so excited to see how this format pans out, because for the first time in a long time, the format actually looks like it might be in a healthy spot. So that's gonna wrap things up for today's video. Thank you guys again. Comment down below if there's any other decks you think I should consider. As mentioned, make sure you're subscribed, because we have the tech card video and the best budget decks of next format coming out. But once again, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and here's hoping to see you on the next one. Peace.